The Oklahoma wind howled through the broken windows of a small house on the wrong side of town. Inside, a little girl named Sandra Louise Singers, just 3 years old, watched her father disappear for the last time. He didn't leave a note, no promises, just vanished. Her mother, desperate and drowning in poverty, turned to the streets to survive. And little Sandra, bright, cunning, and already hardened, learned early that survival wasn't handed to you. You had to take it. She grew up fast, too fast. By the time Sandra hit her teens, teachers called her troubled. Animals on the playground went missing. Classmates kept their distance. Something about her eyes, they didn't reflect much light. She bullied, she manipulated, and she learned to hide it all behind a disarming smile. Then came Los Angeles. Adopted by a wealthy family, the Chambers, she got a taste of the good life. And she wanted more. Glamour, power, money. Not by earning it, by crafting it. Like a con artist molds a lie to fit the room. She took on a new name, Sante. It sounded wealthy. It sounded French. It sounded nothing like the past she left behind. By 18, she was married. By 20, a mother. By 25, divorced and already weaving insurance scams into her everyday life, like silk into a dress. It wasn't about necessity anymore. It was about control. Then, in 1971, she married again, this time to Kenneth Kimes Sr., a multimillionaire motel mogul, older, wealthy, easily influenced. And now she had everything she wanted: a mansion, a driver, and a new baby boy, Kenneth Jr. She would raise him herself. No nannies, no babysitters, just mother and son. Her project, her protege, her partner in the making. The Kimes mansion shimmered like a mirage in the Nevada desert. White columns, black-tinted windows, and the hum of wealth pulsing beneath every chandelier. But inside, the air was thick with tension, manipulation, and the strange, intoxicating energy of secrets being born. Sante had everything she wanted. A rich husband who rarely asked questions, a house staff who obeyed without speaking, and a son, a quiet, intelligent boy named Kenneth, who watched everything. And he learned fast. While other kids played video games or rode bikes, Kenneth sat beside his mother in her study, watching her craft phone calls with fake accents, forge names with flair, and write checks from accounts that weren't hers. Each scheme was a lesson, each lie a bedtime story. She didn't scold, she instructed. Never say, "I don't know." Always look them in the eye when you lie. Guilt is for amateurs. He was her shadow, her creation. But not everyone stayed quiet. Housekeepers whispered that Sante was dangerous. Some claimed to have been locked in rooms, threatened with deportation, or denied wages. She hired undocumented workers deliberately, people too afraid to go to the police. They were easy to control, and Sante liked control. One woman escaped and spoke to authorities. It didn't take long for federal agents to gather enough evidence. In 1985, the Kimes residence was raided. Agents seized documents, testimonies, and proof that Sante had been holding workers against their will, some beaten, some starved, all silenced by fear. The press called it modern-day slavery. Sante called it slander. In court, her designer suits couldn't mask the trail of abuse. She was convicted under federal anti-slavery laws and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Kenneth Sr., humiliated and broken, distanced himself from the scandal and died shortly after her incarceration. But Kenneth Jr., still just a teenager, didn't turn away. He waited. While his mother served time, he drifted between private schools and legal guardians. But no amount of structure could unlearn what he'd already been taught. His worldview had been shaped not by morality, but by strategy. Not by truth, but by advantage. He sent her letters. She responded with coded language and instructions. still in control, even from behind bars. And when Sante walked free in 1989, she wasn't interested in rebuilding a quiet life. She didn't look back. She didn't apologize. She came out with sharper edges and bigger plans. The world had tried to put her in a box, and she would punish it for that. But this time, she wouldn't be alone. Kenneth Jr. was no longer a boy. He was her mirror, and their next chapter would be written in fire. They arrived like ghosts. New city, new names, new targets. By the early 1990s, Sante and Kenneth Jr. had become nomads of deceit, drifting from hotel to mansion, from scam to scheme, leaving behind a trail of suspicious fires, vanishing assets, and confused victims. But nothing ever stuck, because nothing was ever traceable. Sante had perfected the art of the exit before the question was asked. She used aliases like weapons, forged documents with surgical precision, and never stayed anywhere long enough for roots or suspicions to grow. Kenneth Jr., tall now, polished, and eerily calm, followed her lead. He moved with the quiet grace of someone who had spent years studying the art of blending in. And together, they hunted. Their victims weren't the desperate or the poor. Sante aimed higher. Real estate developers, wealthy widows, bankers, lawyers, people with more than enough to notice when a little went missing, but not enough to believe it could happen to them. But their old playbook, manipulation, forgery, blackmail, wasn't thrilling enough anymore. They wanted more. And so they turned to fire. Small at first, a guest house, a storage unit, then a yacht, always insured, always suspicious. The insurance companies paid out, but the investigators circled. One fire here, one fire there. That's coincidence. But when your name starts showing up in multiple fire reports from Miami to LA, eyebrows rise. Still, Sante was always one step ahead. She spun stories that sounded too outlandish to be fake, and yet they always were. A leaking gas line, a faulty generator, a mysterious intruder. She played the grieving owner, the shocked wife, the confused mother. Tears on cue, papers in hand. In 1991, the heat grew literal. Elmer Holmgren, a lawyer with a past as murky as Sante's, had been one of her collaborators in an arson-for-profit scheme. But Sante didn't trust him. She believed he was talking. She believed he knew too much. One day, Elmer vanished. No body, no trail, no final phone call. The whispers said Sante killed him, hit him with a hammer during a car ride, cleaned it up like she'd done it a dozen times before, and left no trace. Authorities couldn't build a case. No witnesses, no confession. Just the eerie silence of a man who no longer existed. But Sante and Kenneth didn't slow down. They moved on. New country. New scam. In the Bahamas, they tried to launder their past through offshore accounts and real estate deals. There, they met banker Syed Bilal Ahmed, who helped them move money, until he asked too many questions. He was found dead. Kenneth would later admit they drugged him, then drowned him. Quiet, efficient, gone. And yet they kept moving. Because the fire hadn't reached them yet. Not really. Not the kind that burned in courtrooms or prison cells. They still believed they were untouchable. But with every new name they used, every con they pulled, and every silence they created, the flame behind them grew. It wouldn't be long before it caught up. The address was 20 East 65th Street, Manhattan's Upper East Side. Elegant, exclusive, old money. And right at the center of it stood Irene Silverman, an 82-year-old former Radio City Rockette turned millionaire landlady. Regal, sharp, unafraid. She owned the grand limestone townhouse and lived alone in the upper floors. But Irene had rules. She didn't rent to just anyone, especially not long-term tenants without a background check. But when a soft-spoken young man named Manny Guerin applied to lease a room, he brought crisp cash, tailored clothes, and a story about being a wealthy European businessman needing discretion. She gave him the benefit of the doubt. What Irene didn't know was that Manny was actually Kenneth Kimes Jr., and he wasn't looking for a place to stay. He was looking for a place to steal. Behind him, always watching, was his mother, Sante. She kept her distance, but made frequent phone calls, posed as her son's assistant, and monitored every move. This wasn't just a con. This was their biggest play yet. Irene's townhouse was worth $7.7 million, and the Kimeses weren't interested in renting. They wanted to own it, without paying a cent. The plan was twisted but precise. Forge documents, impersonate Irene, and steal the property right out from under her. Sante had already begun practicing Irene's signature, creating fake IDs, and plotting ways to assume her identity. But Irene wasn't easy prey. She was observant. She noticed the strange phone calls, the odd behavior. Kenneth never looked her in the eyes. He avoided questions. There were noises in the hallway when no one should have been there, and she began to push back. She questioned the lease agreement, asked for more documentation, began documenting things herself. That's when Sante and Kenneth knew. It was now or never. On July 5, 1998, Irene Silverman was seen alive for the last time. That morning, she spoke to a friend on the phone and mentioned her unease about her tenant. Hours later, she vanished. No struggle, no forced entry, just gone. That same day, Sante and Kenneth checked out of the nearby Helmsley Hotel. With them, they took Irene's forged deed, her checkbook, social security documents, wigs, disguises, a stun gun, and a .22 caliber pistol. They left Manhattan like ghosts, but this time they didn't disappear. The FBI had been watching them, circling slowly as the lies finally began to fall apart. The Kimeses were arrested in New York just days later, caught with the evidence in hand. But no body. That was the twist. Irene Silverman had vanished without a trace. There was no crime scene, no blood, no confession. Just two con artists and a stack of forgeries. But what the Kimeses didn't know was that this time people were watching too closely. The law was patient, and so was justice. The courtroom was packed. New York press filled the aisles, photographers waited at every entrance, and strangers leaned forward in their seats, searching the faces of a mother and son who now wore handcuffs instead of disguises. The charges were staggering: fraud, conspiracy, forgery, and the most haunting of all, the murder of Irene Silverman. But there was one problem. No body, no trace of Irene had ever been found. Still, the evidence was chilling. In Sante and Kenneth's luggage, forged property documents in Irene's name, a detailed plan to impersonate her and claim the townhouse, wigs, stun guns, handcuffs, a .22 caliber pistol, trash bags, gloves, cleaning supplies. It wasn't just suspicious. It was surgical, calculated, cold. But without a body, the defense leaned hard into doubt. Sante, ever the performer, played her part to perfection. She scoffed at the accusations, laughed at prosecutors, portrayed herself as a victim of a media witch hunt. She called it a landlord dispute. Kenneth, however, began to crack. Behind closed doors, he talked, first in fragments, then in full. He admitted they had killed Irene. He described drugging her, suffocating her, and disposing of the body in a way that would ensure she was never found. But in court, he clammed up. The prosecution pushed forward without his testimony, using surveillance footage, hotel records, handwriting experts, and voice analysis from phone calls placed using Irene's identity. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed a ghostly outline of a murder without a corpse. And the public was riveted. Here was a well-dressed, gray-haired woman with a slight frame and designer glasses. a grandmother, some said, being portrayed as the mastermind of one of the most cold-blooded murder plots in modern New York history. And beside her, her son, quiet, calm, always a few feet behind her, like a shadow, like a servant, like something more. The jury deliberated for 5 days. When they returned, the message was clear. Guilty. On all counts. Life sentences. No parole. Not just for the murder of Irene Silverman, but for the elaborate, years-long web of fraud and manipulation that preceded it. But the story wasn't over. Just as they were settling into their prison cells, separate, silent, and finally caged, California came calling. A new body had been found. 2,000 miles from Manhattan, in the sun-baked shadows of Los Angeles, a cold case was quietly rising from the dead. David Kasdan, former associate, former friend, former loose end, had been found in 1998, long before the Irene Silverman trial. Shot once in the back of the head, stuffed into a dumpster near LAX. No suspects, no motive, just another body in a city full of them. But now, investigators were looking again, through a new lens, a Kimes-shaped lens. Backtracking financial records, they discovered Kasdan's name on forged loan documents worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. His signature, identical to ones Sante had faked before. And shortly before his murder, Kasdan had reportedly confronted her, furious that his name had been used without consent. He threatened to go to the authorities. He never made it. When the case was reopened, California prosecutors moved swiftly. The New York convictions gave them leverage, but they wanted something more than another trial. They wanted a confession. And they got one. Kenneth Jr. flipped, not just to save himself, but perhaps because something inside him, after years of silence and obedience, finally broke. In court, he gave chilling testimony. He admitted to shooting David Kasdan in the back of the head. He said his mother orchestrated the entire setup. She gave the order. She laid the trap. He pulled the trigger. And even then, Sante never blinked. During the trial, she maintained her innocence with theatrical flair. She called the proceedings a farce, blamed her enemies, and labeled her own son a liar and a coward. Her voice, once charming, now sounded like a curse. But no one believed her anymore. The jury did not hesitate. Another guilty verdict. Another life sentence. For the first time in her life, Santa Quimes had no escape route, no false identity, no cash hidden in safes, no son at her side. She died in 2014 in Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, unrepentant, defiant, and alone. Kenneth Kimes Jr. remains in prison in California. He writes occasionally to journalists. Some believe he regrets what he did. Others believe he's just learned how to wear remorse like another disguise. The Kimes case left a legacy not just of crime, but of duality. A mother and son bound by blood and betrayal. A love that manipulated, corrupted, and destroyed.